I'm Bill Dores. I'm the vice chair of the International League of People's Struggle, and I'm in the International Action Center, which is an anti-imperialist solidarity organization in this country, which joined the International League of People's Struggle, which is chaired by the great Filipino revolutionary Jose Maria Sison, who's living in exile in the Netherlands. And I was elected the vice chair of their last international assembly, which was in Manila 2 years ago. And the reason we joined is because at this assembly, it brought together 400, roughly 400 organizations from nearly 40 countries. The largest labor union in Australia, the Construction, Mining and Engineering Union, the Peasant Alliance of Southeast Asia, including the Peasant Union of Indonesia, which has over 1 million members. It brought together community and labor and student and peasant and fishing people, organizations, LGBT organizations, environmentalists from all over the world, but all of which, and we had 17 concerns, but the unifying thread is that all of us see that imperialism is the main enemy, the main problem facing humanity. And that can sound like a rhetorical exercise. Imperialism to many people it sounds like just a curse word. Che Guevara said 40 years ago that U.S. imperialism is the number one enemy of humanity. And Huey P. Newton, who founded the Black Panther Party, said, we will never have freedom until the imperialist is stripped of his power. Back in around 1900, tens of thousands of people in the United States, I think it was actually hundreds of thousands, joined the Anti-Imperialist League. And they were there to oppose the war in the Philippines, when the U.S. invaded the Philippines and killed nearly 1 million people. A war that's unrecorded virtually in U.S. history books. We're only told about the Spanish-American War, which was the cover for the U.S. invasion of the Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico. And many of the people in the Anti-Imperialist League were small farmers and the people who were the base of and small artisans, the people who were the base of the Populist Party, which was really the last gasp of small business, independent producers in the United States who were being crushed by the power of the big banks. And this was the same force that was driving imperial expansion. And they understood that. So what is this thing called imperialism? It's not a policy. That's the most important thing to remember. It's not a policy. It is not driven by stupidity or simple greed or a lust for adventure. It is not about grabbing resources, be it oil or gold or whatever. There's a slogan in the anti-war movement, it was a catchy slogan, no blood for oil. But I think it was misleading because we all need oil. But what the war was about was the compelling drive of the imperialist system, of the imperialist corporations for profit, not oil as a use value, but oil as a commodity. Imperialism is an economic system. It's rather a stage in the development of the capitalist system, and as such, it is compelled to obey certain laws. People often say, when the U.S. does something like invade Iraq and all this money is spent and all this destruction and soldiers are killed and makes the U.S. unpopular, or when the U.S. say supports the Israeli occupation, the Zionist occupation of Palestine with so much money and makes it so hated in the Muslim world, that we, quote, we are hurting our own interests. That's a misunderstanding of who we is and what they are, who they are, and what their interests are. They being the ruling class of this country. Imperialism is capitalism in its purely parasitic monopoly phase. Simply and precisely, it's the very thing that Occupy Wall Street said it was rebelling against. It is the predominance of finance capital over industry and the state. It is the rule of the banks. And while in an earlier stage of capitalism, the driving need is trade, was selling, the export of commodities, under imperialism, which really developed into a full-fledged system in the 19th century, the driving, compelling force of everything is the need to reinvest surplus capital at a higher rate of profit, to export capital, to invest. And that compelling need is the only way to understand U.S. quote policy from the invasion of the Philippines in 1898 to the covert operations going on against Syria today, or the war threats against Iran. You know, when I was young, I became politically aware at the age of 13 during the Vietnam War in '68. That was the year of the Tet Offensive. And then it was, you know, the war in Vietnam was raging. 500,000 troops were there. The body bags were pouring back. You saw the scenes of napalm and white phosphorus being dropped on peasants and children running down the road, burning with napalm. And the war was so expensive that the dollar had to go off the gold standard. And of course, this was all justified in the name of the fight against communism. We heard if we don't stop them in Vietnam, Chinese troops would be marching down Fifth Avenue. That was supposed to be a bad thing. But in fact, the U.S. invaded the Philippines before communism existed as an organized ideology anywhere in Asia. The U.S. Marines looted Beijing in 1900. That was, I think Mao Zedong was 3 years old at the time. Now, 20 years ago, the United States achieved the crowning after spending trillions, tens of trillions of dollars on the Cold War. It achieved victory. The Soviet bloc collapsed, fell, was destroyed. And that was supposed to be the end of history. You'd have a peace dividend. All these hundreds of billions that had to be spent on war would be used for hospitals and schools, and everybody would have a job. But instead, within a few years, the U.S., Germany, West Germany, were bombing Yugoslavia. And then there was a war against Iraq and another war against Iraq and Afghanistan. And they found a new enemy to replace so-called communism, which was Islam or Islamic terrorism, except when they're funding Islamic terrorism like in Syria, so-called Islamic terrorism. Whatever is useful, because imperialism, as some British statesman said, has no permanent allies, only permanent interests. Monopoly arises from the need of capitalists to protect themselves from their own crisis. And what is that crisis? It's scarcity. Is it scarcity? Is it too little? No, it's because that crisis is unique to the capitalist system. Too much. They produce more than they can sell, more than they can invest. That not only too many cars to be sold at a profit, too much oil to be sold at a profit, but too much capital. They've accumulated too much capital to invest at a profit. And how do you deal with the crisis of too much? Well, the Karlster said it back in 1848. Karl Marx said it back in 1848 in the Communist Manifesto, even before imperialist monopoly existed. He said, by a destruction of a mass of the means of production. He also talked about how for 3 years of prosperity in the Engels did this, so the textile industry in Britain required the starvation of hundreds of thousands of textile workers in India, because the British textile industry could only expand by the destruction of textiles in India. So when you see like what the U.S. has done in Iraq, go back a second, and this is a million times what Marx said in 1848 is a million times more true in the age of imperialism, be it with the Rockefellers crushed out independent oil producers in Pennsylvania and Ohio. It was called the Cleveland Massacre and the Pennsylvania Oil Wars to create the Standard Oil Trust. Or 130 years later, when the great direct descendant of the Standard Oil Trust, the much, much bigger but still Rockefeller-controlled ExxonMobil conglomerate, sends the U.S. Army to destroy Iraq because its nationalized oil industry owns 10% of the world's oil resources, and U.S. companies weren't making a dime off of that. And when we see what they achieved in Iraq, the destruction there that's torn that country apart, that's not a failure of policy or a failure of imperialism. That's what they want. That's their achievement. That brought them it was the most profitable war in history. You see what's happening in the Congo, which should be such a rich country, being torn apart. That's imperialism in action. When you see what's happening in Syria, tearing apart that country, that's imperialism in action. And when you see what they're doing to Detroit, and that's imperialism in action, or trying to destroy the post office because so they can invest in privatized delivery services because they've always got to find the only way they can expand at this stage of human development is by destruction. Um, at Occupy Wall Street a couple of years ago, I saw a sign saying unemployment 3% in 1952, 10% today. What went wrong? And this reflects a blind spot in the U.S. labor movement, very important, and because of its failure to take on imperialism, to see imperialism as the enemy, because this myth of this period when the good old days, when there was full employment and good jobs, well, for many people, for many, especially white people in this country, workers, there was a huge improvement in living standards after World War II. Due to the fact that the United States had a monopoly position in the world, and it was worth it to buy labor peace with higher wages and higher, better benefits and avoid strikes because the factories were humming, and a huge middle class or professional class was created, and the children of workers could often get, professional or administrative jobs or advertising or something. When we look at the eviscerated state of the U.S. labor movement today, and we see that young workers are lucky if they can get jobs at $9 an hour, the seeds of that lay in the power that U.S. imperialism achieved back then. Because imperialism cannot stand still, it has to destroy. They have to look for new sources of profit, and ultimately, they have to turn in when they can't find anything anywhere else. They have to turn in on themselves, on their own infrastructure, on their own country. And because this is an imperialist country, because the banks rule, and the source of the power of the bankers is the profits they draw in from all over the world. And you cannot defeat the banks, you cannot defeat corporate America, you cannot stop the foreclosures and the layoffs without breaking their power, and that can only be done in unity with the people all over the world who are fighting imperialism. Which, back to the old Lenin slogan, workers and oppressed people of the world unite, because he saw that a united front had to be built of everyone who was being affected by imperialism in order to achieve victory for the working class. And that's what we need to do. Thank you.